Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Rose. I am a final year PhD student at Stanford's computer science department. And yeah, broadly, I work on machine learning and NLP for education. I'm on the job market this year, but I just wanted to make a disclaimer. This isn't my job talk, so I really welcome like a lot of feedback on, yeah, from people. So with that, we'll just get started. So, in many fundamental areas of society, like education and healthcare, experts are really indispensable. So, in education, for instance, the experts are the experienced teachers that deliver high quality education to students through interactions like these. But similarly, experts are also the ones that train the next generation of educators, like the novices, to have similarly effective interactions. However, one of the largest problems in our society is access to expertise. So, access to expertise is often very limited. Experts are scarce and really expensive to hire. So, as a result, many students, and particularly students from underserved communities, are the least likely ones to get a good education, even though they have most to gain from a good one. And this lack of access to experts directly affects not only their quality of education, but it is also at the heart of broader societal inequities. To tackle these real world challenges, the AI community has positioned language models as a really promising solution to democratize expertise. So, for example, also, can people see this? I feel like I'm standing enough. Okay. Okay. So, for example, Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, recently described the future potential of language models as virtual tutors who can provide personalized instruction in any subject in any language at whatever pace. So essentially, language models do hold this like really promising potential of being a transformative force, enabling access to expertise because they're scalable to millions. However, realizing this potential is far from trivial. Just because we have accessible interactions don't necessarily mean that these are effective interactions. So language models we know can also fail in replicating expert behaviors in many different ways. So for instance, by just giving away the answer to students. And when students struggle, like learning is really hard. So we're going to try to also find ways to be able to shortcut and get answers from systems, even if they're instructed not to give away answers. Additionally, unlike human experts, language models lack that touch, that human touch needed to keep students actually motivated and, oh, whoops, one sec, sorry. Motivated and engaged to get through learning difficulties. And oftentimes the burden actually falls on the student to lead the effective interactions. So when students struggle, it's actually really easy for them just to close their tab on ChatGPT or the language model and end their learning interaction. And so what I've been thinking about during the course of my PhD is instead of having these two extremes of either choosing between scarce human experts or just fully relying on automated language model systems to scale the quality of interactions, what if we could actually blend the best of both worlds? So imagine a future where actually every person, whether it's a novice in education or in healthcare, could actually be empowered with real-time expertise. What this means is that like every interaction will feel like it's guided by an expert, but with the scalability of AI enhancing the human touch of the novice. So concretely, what I mean is that in real-time interactions like the ones that I've been showing, such as teaching a student, instead of the novice by themselves struggling to help the student, or even the language model just giving away the answer, we can enable novices to perform at an expert level, simultaneously also providing students the quality of interactions that they typically only get with a seasoned teacher. Yeah.
Can we ask questions?
Oh yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. When we think about education, think about like in-person classroom, like it's very busy. Like teachers have very limited space in their mind to deal with a lot of things, right? So there's very busy. So if you provide support in real time, they might have limited attention span to get that input in real time. But you can also think about preparing them to be really ready for whatever complex interaction they're gonna face in the classroom. So can you tell us a little bit more about your choice in terms of why you focus on real time rather than like preparing people beforehand?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think that both doing it, I guess I'll term them as like online versus offline preparation or support. They're not mutually exclusive. I think they all kind of lead to the same goal of like enabling the whoever's performing the actual interaction to raise the quality of the interaction. I think for the talk that I'm going to be focusing on, it's going to be on the online setting, but I've had also works in the offline setting of like, can you, and also related, of course, to your work, Jing, of like, how do you kind of do post-interaction analysis, provide feedback, automated feedback to teachers so they kind of are a lot more aware about their interactions. Some of the challenges I want to raise in the talk are related to like, in the moment when you are practically, limited to a 40 to, 50 minutes like teaching session, there's just so many things that you can only recall or like remember how to do. And so I'm going to touch on some of the challenges of like, how do you actually train novices to do that on the ground work? I think again, both online, offline versions, they're not mutually exclusive, but for this talk at least, I'm going to focus on the online challenges. Yeah. So with that motivation in mind, in today's talk, what I'm going to argue is that a lot of my work will be focused on looking at how can we embed expert-like thinking into language models, and only by then can we empower every person to become an expert in these kinds of live interactions. And by doing so, we're scaling expertise via language models. And so in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to unroll that insight in two parts. So in the first part, I'm going to focus on what we can do in terms of the models that we're building. To do that, I'm going to briefly talk about this adaptation approach for language models called Bridge, which explicitly extracts the latent reasoning of experts to adapt models. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce this recent, exciting, like real-time human AI interaction approach that's supposed to be able to scale that expertise that we're able to get now from the language model and then do it real time on the order of thousands of tutoring sessions or interactions. And so with this outline, let me first begin with Bridge. To unpack what's going on here, I'm going to start with how we typically try to train or adapt language models for downstream use cases like in education. And so imagine training a model, and what we typically do is that we'll try to curate a high quality expert written data set of responses. So in this case, it's going to be in a conversation setting. And we can try to use this data set in different ways to be able to adapt the model. So for example, I could show the model a series of examples, do in context learning for the model to try to get a sense of the kind of behaviors it should try to generate. Or I could actually try to train the model to just directly predict the expert's responses. And for a long time, these kinds of approaches worked really well for a lot of NLP tasks like machine translation or text classification. But in these kinds of tasks, which they typically don't really require a lot of higher level orders of like cognitive reasoning, but unfortunately, in these kinds of complex interactions that we're dealing with, we get responses that look somewhat like this, which will look similar to maybe what an expert might do, like proposing to solve another problem, but they'll fail in really subtle ways. So in this context, you'll see that the problem that the student gets incorrectly is about Bob has 10 apples and gives 5 away. The student gets it wrong, and so the model proposes like, okay, let's try another problem, but then repeats the same problem that the student had already gotten incorrect. And so the kind of the key issue and the observation here is that experts in these kinds of complex interactions have to make a lot more inferences that are unobservable from the interaction, but are really critical in being able to respond effectively. Like, what does the student maybe not understand, and how can I kind of tweak the problem for them to actually get the concept behind it? So to kind of summarize, in today's setting, the way that we currently have language models learn behaviors is implicitly through data and training. But what if we could actually make expert thinking that's typically unobservable actually really explicit? Not only would we be able to understand how experts reason in these settings, but also we can try to guide models to generate more effective responses in these interactions. And so the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to introduce an approach called Bridge, which tries to extract the reasoning patterns from experts. So we really want to make their latent reasoning process, like inferring things about the student or about the lesson objective or things that they want to achieve in this interaction, to be a lot more apparent. And by this, we're able to ideally bridge knowledge gaps and also raise the quality of interactions. So in this kind of setting, typically we can't really observe what experts are thinking about. And so in Bridge, what we do is that we're just actually going to directly ask experts to talk out loud about their reasoning and thinking. So experts are given examples that they'll have to annotate. So in this case, annotation just means like writing their next response, but also they have to talk out loud about like, why were they writing that kind of response, or what were they thinking about, what's going through their mind. In our specific setting for this work, what we were doing was we were looking at settings where students were struggling, and experts were shown conversation snippets of about 5 messages from a real-world K-12 tutoring setup. And so examples might also include like these kinds of mistakes that were pretty typical in elementary and middle school math concepts. I'd also worked with about 4 experienced teachers for conducting this methodology, where each of the experts had about a decade's worth of real teaching experience from many different school backgrounds, including public, charter, Title I schools, and private settings. Cool. So going back now to the method, when we asked experts to talk out loud, initially these transcripts are pretty long and really unstructured because they're just kind of giving us like all their thoughts about what's going through their minds. And so if we were to naively put this into a language model, the language models will have a really hard time actually following these reasoning traces. And so what we do in Bridge is that as we collect more and more examples, we can actually start to find similarities in how experts start to reason, such as like, what are they noticing? Oh, this seems to be happening a lot in all these transcripts. Or, why do they want to respond in a certain way, or how? And we can start to then distill these kinds of common structures into a discrete set of instructions to capture how experts think, while also being able to instruct the language model to follow this kind of pattern. So in our setting, because we're focused on experts helping struggling students, the resulting like reasoning structure that came about was for the expert to first think about the student's level of understanding, then figuring out their remediation strategy, and then towards what pedagogical goal or intent. And so just to kind of make that more concrete with the data set that we had open sourced, an example of the Bridge annotations with the explicit latent reasoning might look something like this. Well, we're going to build a triplet of examples. So on the left-hand side, I'm just showing you like a snippet of the context, which would typically be 5 messages that the expert had seen. And then on the other side, we're going to have the final response that the expert wanted to annotate with. And then in the middle, we're going to be able to also construct the expert's like latent reasoning pattern. So in this case, the expert thought that the student was just guessing their answer. And so what they wanted to do was to propose a problem-solving strategy to be able to help their thinking. And these kinds of latent structures are some things that you can kind of see in their final response. So like here, the expert is proposing for the student to make a drawing of the problem to help them better understand that, like to support their thinking and, doing subtraction in this case. So what do we now do when we actually want to operationalize this into a language model is that, and then some details about the data set. We ended up working with those 4 experts and curated a data set of 700 annotated examples where each of the triplets will look something like this. And so finally, what we can do is we can actually turn these latent thoughts into explicit natural language instructions. So this purple box just representing the natural language description of what you had just seen before. And now with this kind of data set, what you can do is a bunch of different things that we had seen before. So we can do like in context learning, we can do direct fine tuning or training, or we can just directly instruct the models to follow these instructions. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about how we're evaluating our method. So in evaluations, again, we recruited 70 different teachers that were not part of the actual development process. And each of these teachers were shown both the context leading up to the mistake and then the message that the original novice tutor had written compared to an alternative response. And these alternative responses will be either the actual human expert's response, it'll be the language model's response, or other baseline comparisons we want to do. And what these teachers were asked then to do were on a Likert rating between -2, meaning preferring more of the original response, or 2 being preferring like the alternative. They were asked like, how much more do they prefer one or the other? How much, which one do they find more useful than another? And so on. And so these dimensions for preference, usefulness, etc., were curated both from a mix of the NLP and education literature for looking at like what are good responses in reaction to helping remediate a struggling student. So with that now in mind, we're going to now go into the quantitative findings of that setup. So on the x-axis, what you can see here are just the different dimensions I alluded before about whether the teachers preferred, the given response, found it useful, caring, not robotic, and then the overall score. For this talk, I'm just going to be focusing on just 4 of our comparisons. So comparing the human expert to the bridge instructed model of GPT-4, the out-of-the-box GPT-4 model, and then the fine-tuned Flan T5 model. These are all, I guess, just different language models. And then finally, on the y-axis, I'm going to be reporting those Likert ratings. One thing to observe on the y-axis is that they're all positive numbers ranging from 0 and above, because all of these methods did better than what the original novice had written. So now with that in mind, let's look at some examples. So the first thing that you should observe here is that we can see the purple bar, or our bridge instruction model, did the best overall. So better than the fine-tuned model in gray, and then also the blue model, which was the out-of-the-box model. What was really interesting was that across all of the dimensions here, the human expert was always considered the best written responses. And so this is a pattern that you're going to see also when we look at the usefulness rating. So we can see a similar trend where clearly the purple bar is closing the gap between the out-of-the-box model in blue and then also the expert. But none of the models seem to just be able to surpass the expert's response quality. And then finally, I'm just showing you all of the bars here where in general, we're seeing that consistent trend too. Yes.
Just a quick question. Did you do the statistical analysis or did you just single report?
Yeah, we also have statistical significance on most of the findings. I can't remember which ones were not statistically significant, but in general, the trends seem to indicate that like Bridge was always doing better than its counterpart, and then the expert in general, I think like you could probably, I don't exactly remember what the standard error bar is here, but there were some where the gap wasn't significant. Yeah.
Just to clarify, is Bridge trained on the expert data set? But what's the relationship between the two?
Yeah, so for this specific setup for Bridge and GPT-4, we didn't fine tune the model. It was just an explicit instruction following that reasoning trace that I had shown before. So I'll just preview it again. So this is what the response looked like. For the out-of-the-box model, just to explain it in comparison, what was given there was just like, please provide a useful and I think it was like adapted for the dimensions that we had. It was like, please provide a useful and caring response to the student. And then we showed, again, the same context. So these are the results that we're reporting here. And there were a couple other models that we had compared, like a K-shot model, so showing like 5 series of examples that followed similar strategies. And we had other like open source and closed source models. Here I'm just reporting the best models. So GPT-4 seemed to be the better class of models in this setting. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, so these preferences were from, like, you said NLP and education experts?
So the dimensions that you see here were all kind of curated from the literature in that setting. So
yeah. I mean, like, who gave the preferences?
Yeah, so these were all from 70 teachers with different kinds of teaching experiences or backgrounds. Yeah.
I'm wondering if, like, if there's any insights if you were to ask the students, like, which one they think is more useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, or like if you consider that at all.
Yeah, that's definitely something we've considered. In a different work that I'd done on growth mindset, we'd surveyed both teachers and students because there's a lot of literature that demonstrates inconsistencies about like sometimes both what teachers find useful is also what students find useful, but sometimes also not. But in this setting, we're not doing that. But I think it's just also another good sanity check to do to make sure, like, for whatever given target population you care about, that ideally both groups of interlocutors actually think that they're good responses. Yeah. But yeah, great question. So with that, I'm going to go on to the next slide. So before what I'd shown you were our quantitative results, kind of aggregated over these different scores and Likert ratings. And so now what I want to show you is we can also qualitatively examine the language that's being generated from these different methods, just to kind of get a sense of like what they typically say in these kinds of responses. And so here, just for simplicity, what I'm going to be showing you are kind of the more likely pairs of words or bigrams that the out-of-the-box GPT-4 model would generate versus the bridge model that we had seen to be performing the best out of all of the models that we had tested. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using this log odds method from a previous work that's able to kind of adjust and account for both like frequent words, but like what's distinctive in these kinds of groups. So when we use this log odds method, we can start to surface these common pairs, and we start to see some patterns in the kind of language that's being used in the responses. So what I'm going to kind of draw out here is that what we're starting to notice in the out-of-the-box GPT-4 model is that a lot of the language seems to be very answer or outcome oriented. So they'll use language like, oh, I appreciate your effort, or that's a correct solution, when in this setting, all the solutions are actually incorrect. Or they'll praise the student about like a good effort or a good job every single time. Whereas in the bridge instructed model, what we're seeing is that a lot of it is more about the problem solving process. So they'll ask about like, oh, what did you do to arrive at your answer? Can you kind of explain what you're thinking about? And so kind of the conclusion that we made from this work was that it seemed like the bridge instructions were helping the model to generate more expert-like behavior, where in this setting, expert-like behavior means developing the student's actual understanding, or at least giving them a more productive interaction for learning math, which was the data, or which was the context that we had studied in this. Okay, so with that, now that we've explored how we can develop algorithms for able to embed expert-like thinking into models, I want to revisit the thesis statement that I had presented earlier and turn to the second part of the talk, which is how can we, now that we've extracted these expert reasoning patterns, how can we use them to scale expertise to thousands of real-time live tutoring interactions or interactions in general? And so the approach that we're going to take towards this vision is we're going to talk about Tutor Copilot, which is this recent human AI system approach on scaling this to live tutoring. So I want to give some context about what kind of led up to Tutor Copilot. It's also related to Jing, like your comment about this like distinction between preparing teachers versus doing it real time. And so let me start with like the realities of how people would typically become an expert, either in education or healthcare or law in general. So one way to do this is to go through what I'm going to call as expert guided training, or what some people might know as like professional development programs, where these programs can cost thousands of dollars per teacher annually. They're extremely expensive. On top of that, these kinds of training programs are often pretty disconnected from the practical needs of these novices, because they happen in workshops that occur outside the teaching context, or they could be online training modules, which are pretty rigid. They're like, there's a fixed set of modules that teachers have to go through. And so it's not really connected to the specific needs that they might be seeing in the classroom, or the issues that their students are having, but they want to best support. And so due to this kind of cost and misalignments, what ends up happening is that many novices don't have access to that kind of expert guidance, and they're actually just forced to develop their skills on the job. And this often results in many missed learning opportunities for students, because novices have to learn through trial and error over the years. So like trying out different ways of responding to struggling students until the novices can actually become experts of their own to having these effective interactions. And so today, because we don't really have scalable real-time guidance, we rely on years of experience to become experts at fostering effective interactions. But what if we could actually cut this time into months rather than years? So not only develop the skills of novices in much faster time, but also immediately deliver effective interactions for students or patients, in any domain. So to make this kind of idea concrete, instead of having novices, struggle to figure out what they want to say, in these kinds of moments of learning where the student is making a mistake, imagine if the novice actually had access to language model companion. And so in these moments where the novice is, not really sure how they should respond, they could click on this language model companion or this co-pilot and be able to generate real-time suggestions. So for instance, maybe this co-pilot could start to mention these like expert curated strategies that we had seen in the previous work from Bridge, such as asking a question or being able to provide a hint. But not only that, real time, they'll be able to see these actually usable suggestions that are contextualized to the actual interaction that they're having, such as in this case, asking a question about, prompting them to do the subtraction when they set the problem up, and to also consider other alternative responses about how they can lead the conversation. So helping them at least guide through this kind of decision-making process as they're doing this interaction real time. And so in this study, what we're going to be doing is we're going to ask the question of, to what extent can this kind of approach of assisting the human or augmenting the human novice change both the ways that the novice learns on the job, but also the experience of the other person on the other side of the interaction, like the student, how much can they actually benefit from a more effective interaction? Cool. So to answer this question, what we did last year was we conducted the first randomized control trial of a human AI approach in live tutoring. And concretely, what we're really interested here is we're interested in answering the following question. So to what extent does this kind of approach actually impact the other person on the other side, so the student's learning? We might also be interested in questions like, okay, well, maybe it has an effect, but like, how might this effect be different across different kinds of groups? So how you split up, let's say, the initial tutoring quality of the tutor. And then finally, we might be interested in the mechanism of change, right? Like maybe we detect change on the first few questions, but we're really interested in like, how did this change actually happen in the interaction? And so what we're going to do here is explore, like, can we pick up on any differences measured through language in the interaction? To preview some of these questions, what we did find in our study was that students were 4 percentage points more likely to master their math curriculum topics. We also found in particular that the lower rated, less experienced tutors were benefiting the most from the intervention. And finally, tutors who had access to Tutor Copilot were also more likely to develop language to develop the students' math skills. So I want to talk a little bit about the study design, the logistics, before actually jumping into the analysis for the work. So for this concrete study, we're working with about 1,800 students and about 900 tutors. The students are all coming from a Southern school district where the majority of schools are from Title I schools. Title I schools are schools that receive federal funding to support students from low-income families. And the kind of tutoring that they're partaking in is in-school high-dosage tutoring, which means that in the students' class schedule, they'll have certain periods, so 1 to 3 sessions of tutoring dedicated to that. So they'll do it in school. And our specific study took place in last academic year in the spring quarter for about 2 months. And concretely, the final dataset sample that we're going to be conducting this analysis on spans about 4,000 sessions with about 500,000 messages sent. A majority of these sessions happened with elementary school students, but the rest, a quarter with middle school students. And finally, we're going to be using the Bridge GPT-4 model from the previous work as the language model that's powering, what's generating the suggestions under the hood. Okay, So in terms of the actual study, I'm just, for people who are not familiar with what an intervention or RCT is, we're going to be using this kind of methodology to be able to determine the causal effect of, a specific action on outcomes. So in this case, what we're interested in is what's the impact of Tutor Copilot on the educational outcomes of students. And so to do so, what we're doing is we're going to be randomly picking or, splitting the tutors into two groups. One group is the treatment group, and these tutors get access to Tutor Copilot. And the other group, the control group, they won't get access to Tutor Copilot, and so they'll do tutoring as normal. I'm just going to kind of preview our primary model, but essentially what we're doing is just like we want to perform this linear regression that kind of tells us the effect of having access or not having access to Tutor Copilot on the outcome of interest. So to give you kind of like a really visual feel of what the control tutors or the treatment tutors see, the control tutors will see something like this, where I worked with a tutoring provider to build and integrate Tutor Copilot into their interface. So the interface will have on the left-hand side both the problem displayed as well as a shared whiteboard between the student and the tutor. And then on the right-hand side, you just see the chat that's going between the tutor and the student, because this is a virtual tutoring setup. And typically what happens is that the tutor can just directly write their message on the bottom and then send it to the student. The only difference that happens now with the treatment tutors is that button that we had seen before. And so the treatment tutors, they can receive immediate expert-like guidance by just, clicking that button, and under the hood, it's the bridge instructed GPT-4 model that will generate these kinds of responses. One thing I forgot to mention before is that like the novice actually has a lot of control in this setting. So not only can they, click or consult with Tutor Copilot at any time, but they can also pick a strategy from our previous works or even edit the response or just not even use the response to write to the student. Cool. So, and finally, now leading up to the analysis, I'm just going to talk about the data that we're actually using to perform the analysis. So for our main outcome measure in this talk, we're going to be focusing on something called the exit ticket passing rate. You can think of this as basically the lesson test passing rate for lessons or topics in their curriculum. And this is really important to, keep at a really high level, because if they don't progress or they don't pass their lesson, it limits their progression onto the next lesson. And so you ideally want to maximize the coverage of lessons that the student will see before they actually take their math standardized test score at the end of the year. And then finally, we have a lot of covariate information about both our tutors and students. So things that you might care about the tutor are things like maybe their pre-study quality rating. So these are quality ratings that the tutoring provider had already administered on a pretty regular basis to assess how well their tutors are doing and to distinguish like where their tutors could improve. And so this is like a continuous variable. The student covariate information might be something about their gender or their race, or their pre and post math standardized test scores. And then you'd already seen a lot of the interaction data that we previewed. So the chat transcripts and the Tutor Copilot usage. Okay, so now with all the logistical details in the background, we can now turn back to the research questions I previewed before. So I want to walk through each of these questions and describe a little bit about how we're setting things up and then also our findings. So let's start with the first question, which is about the extent to which Tutor Copilot actually affects student learning. And so the primary model, you had already seen this equation before, is that we want to see the effect of having access to Tutor Copilot on our outcomes. And for those who might not be familiar with this kind of setup, we also just intuitively, we want to adjust for confounders and biases that might also alternatively explain impact on the outcome. So things that you might care about are like, oh, well, maybe the student was already really, really good at math, which is why we're seeing really high outcomes. So the things that we adjust for are things related to the students. We also include information about like the grade and school fixed effects. And then you might also want to account for things related to like, oh, well, the student and tutor pairs might have certain kinds of errors that you want to adjust for as well. If you don't really understand this part, you can just kind of think of it as like, we want to make the appropriate adjustments to better estimate the effect of our treatment. Okay, so with that, now we can move to the results. And so to set things up here on the x-axis, what I'm showing you here, what I will be showing you is 2 bars. One is the tutors that didn't have access to Tutor Copilot and the ones that did have access to Tutor Copilot. And then on the y-axis, what I'm going to be reporting is the student's exit ticket passing rate. So you can think of this as a percentage. Cool. So when we run our regression model, what we'll see is the following. We'll see that our treatment group, the tutors that did have access to Tutor Copilot, did experience a significant increase in their students actually being able to master the curriculum topics. So concretely, we saw a 4 percentage point increase from students being able to pass their lessons or master the content at a 62% rate to a 66% rate. This was really exciting because if we start to think about this at scale, we did a little bit of a back of the envelope calculation. And, if we were kind of in this scenario where we had deployed Tutor Copilot to all students in the school district, we would have seen actually thousands of more lessons being passed, which means that students would have been able to cover more and more lessons in their curriculum to be ready to actually take their standardized tests or their math tests at the end. And so the conclusion from this finding is that, we see really promising and positive significant results on access to Tutor Copilot, significantly impacting student learning. Yes, yeah.
Is it just pass fail on the ticket, or you actually see specific grades? Like you can see whether it's moving students who are just below the threshold to above, or is moving students who are like far away from the threshold to above.
Yeah, so the way that this variable is casted is that it is a binary variable, so either they pass or they don't pass, but there is some granular detail on how that variable is constructed. So the exit ticket is administered on like a series of questions. And so the threshold for determining whether they pass and can move on is based off of a percentage. So it's like, what percentage of those questions did you actually get correct? So you could see like more continuous changes or fine grained changes, but here we're just reporting that either they passed or didn't pass. Yeah. But that's a great question as well. I guess in a somewhat, or maybe not really exactly related, but the next slide, what I want to show you is trying to break these results a little bit more, which is one sec. So in the previous results, what I'd shown you was the effect of access onto outcomes. But you might think, well, some tutors in some of the sessions, they might not actually use Tutor Copilot, so I might not ever click on that button. While in other sessions, they might actually use it. And so to be able to disentangle this effect of, just having it versus actually using it, we're going to extend the previous analysis to a TOT, or treatment on the treated analysis, where we're looking at, we're basically trying to predict this in 2 stages. First, if you had access to it, right? Or sorry, we're trying to predict not just access to the impact on outcomes, but rather we're going to try to modulate the effects through the use. So now, again, it's the same kind of graph, but now on the x-axis, we have without access and then within use of Tutor Copilot. And then again, the y-axis is the same, which is just reporting that passing exit ticket rate. And so when we run this analysis, what we see is the following. We see that actually there's a much stronger effect of tutors actually using Tutor Copilot on the impact of their passing rate. So concretely, now we're seeing a boost from 62% to now students passing at a 76% rate. So concretely, a 14 percentage point increase. And so this was really exciting to see, to kind of disentangle both the effect of just having access to Tutor Copilot, as well as just seeing how is that modulated through the effect of actually using and clicking it. Yeah.
This is using it at least once, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we don't, yes. So this indicator here is going from access to predicting their use, and then using that on predicting the relation to outcomes. There's a version of this of how many times do they actually click on it? We don't run the analysis, but in the paper, you can actually see there are some heterogeneous usage patterns of who tends to click on Tutor Copilot a lot more. I don't want to misquote what we have in the paper, but I think it was one of our quality dimensions was something like more experienced tutors were the ones who were also clicking on Tutor Copilot more, which was interesting. So there could be some interesting effects going on here with like more effective tutors are using it, but somehow maybe they're getting, you know, so anyway, so there's more things to kind of disentangle there as well. Cool. Any other questions? Okay. So with that, the finding from the first question is that, yes, we are seeing students are being able to master the math content a lot more. So now you might want to try to break these results down a little bit by the population of the tutors. So like, you know, are less experienced tutors benefiting from more versus more experienced tutors? So how is this effect broken down by experience? So in this setup, it's going to be very similar to the one that you'd seen before. So on the y-axis, again, we're seeing the exit ticket passing rate from the students. The only difference here is now our x-axis, where our x-axis is going to be breaking the tutor population down into terciles. So we have, I'd mentioned before that we had received the pre-study tutor quality rating from the tutoring provider. And so what we can do with that information is that we can segment the tutors into the lower tercile, the middle tercile, and then the upper tercile based on quality rating. And now we want to see the effect of our of Tutor Copilot. And what we had seen was the following. We had seen that in particular, there was the largest gap that was that we could observe was on the lower quality rating tutors. So in particular, it seemed that there was concretely a 9 percentage point increase in their effectiveness to be able to help students. But as you can see, as the quality rating increases for the tutors, that the more experienced tutors were not experiencing as large of a gap or large of a difference. And so it does seem like we are raising the floor in terms of the quality for the lower end of the tutor population. Right, and so that concretely translated to a 9 percentage point increase here. Okay, and so with that, I'm going to now turn to the last question here, which is about, okay, so now that we've seen the change in quality quantitatively, can we try to understand like the mechanism that's happening or like driving these changes? And because Tutor Copilot essentially is a change about language, we can maybe measure or detect these things on the interaction or language interaction level. So what we're going to do is we're going to operationalize this idea of quality on the level or the use of strategies. So we're going to make this kind of distinction between high quality strategies and low quality strategies, where high quality strategies are ones that are developing the student's understanding, and the low quality ones are the ones that don't engage the student in critical thinking or just give away the answer. And so just kind of sketch out what we're going to do here is that we want to just detect whether or not the high quality strategies are appearing in one versus another, and which could explain the drive and change. Cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the method of how we're going to do this. One of the largest challenges when trying to actually pick up on these changes or trying to understand how to translate, you know, what does a high quality strategy mean is like, how do you map these like high level ideas or high level taxonomies of what we think is high quality and low quality to actually low level examples? So what I mean by this is like, you know, if we take, there was a recent report from the Google Learn LM team that was talking about like the kinds of strategies that teachers really prefer using. And the top rated strategy was something like, you know, ask a question. But what does it mean to ask a question? What does it mean to ask a good question? Because if I were just to naively take a question detection classifier and just run it on my data set, I'll get questions like these, like, are you working on the problem? Did you recheck your answer? Or, you know, which decimal value is greater than 0.72? Or can you tell me which student has the smallest blue part? And what you can kind of get a sense of is that these questions pedagogically feel very different, right? Like on the left-hand side, we're seeing questions that are more about like checking, like, oh, like not really helping the student process or understand the question, whereas the other questions seem to be more about guiding. And so the kind of methodology that we adopt was that how can we refine these high-level taxonomies based on these low-level examples that we're finding and be able to refine the categories of strategies that we actually care about. So in this case, like we refine something that people care a lot about, like asking a question, to something about like asking a guiding question. So where in red, these are the negative examples for that. And then in green, we have the positive examples for that. And so to kind of now take a really abstract view of our method here is that we're going to take, a taxonomy of strategies that people really care about, like asking a good question, refine that. And because we're doing this at scale, we're going to be using some unsupervised learning algorithms like a topic modeling algorithm to be able to kind of cluster and figure out what are the right kinds of examples to include and exclude. And then finally, once we've refined our taxonomy to actually specific examples, we can then use some kind of annotation strategy to annotate this at scale. So in our case, what we did was that we prompted a model like GPT-4 or any other like really powerfully instructed model to initially annotate based on the taxonomy. And then, we can go in and fix the annotations. And finally, fine-tune an open source language model to actually classify and annotate at scale. We train classifiers for each of the strategies. So the F1 scores, or the kind of adjusted accuracy scores for the classifiers, range from 0.65 to 0.9, which are pretty typical and reliable in education settings. And so now going back to this question of how change occurs on interaction, I'm going to describe a little bit of how we're applying the classifiers. So after we've refined our taxonomy and identify the kinds of categories that we care about, what we can now do is try to quantify how often these strategies are more likely to occur in the sessions where the tutors don't have access to Tutor Copilot, versus they do. And on the x-axis, what you can see is the reported log odds method that we had seen before, which again kind of accounts for which of these strategies are more likely to appear in one group versus another. So one example could be, for instance, we can find the adjusted log odds for the strategy of prompting the student to explain. So the way that you can kind of interpret this is that this is like 2 standard deviations more likely to occur in our tutors with Tutor Copilot group than ones without. And then we can also do this for other strategies, like encourage the student in a generic way, like just saying good job or keep going. And we find this actually happens a lot more in tutors without Tutor Copilot. And again, we can just do this for all of them, and we find trends like these. In particular, what you're seeing here is that a lot of the high quality strategies from before that are kind of developing the student's understanding are more likely to occur in the tutors with Tutor Copilot access versus without. So this kind of comes to the conclusion slide for Tutor Copilot, which is that we are finding this kind of mechanism change happening on the interaction level. And in particular, it's kind of by detecting strategies that are meant to foster student understanding, which presumably explains why we are seeing that students are being able to master their topics more, because they're developing the kinds of skills they need to do to be able to, pass the lessons in their curriculum. And so with that kind of popping up now a few levels, hopefully these two works kind of show you this pipeline or process in which we can be able to scale expertise and make it available to many novices who are actually doing these interactions in real time and might require a lot of support in figuring out like what to say to a student instead of starting from a blank slate. There's a lot of exciting things that I've been thinking about in terms of how to extend this kind of work. And there's like 3 directions that feel like, they call on different kinds of disciplines. So one future direction is that in our study, we didn't conduct randomization on the student level. So it was really hard to actually get variation within the students. And so a future extension is actually being able to split up who gets access to Tutor Copilot by students. There's also many other skills that are involved besides just helping struggling students. So for instance, in many domains, even beyond education, like in healthcare, having being able to build strong relationships with, your student or even with your clients is really, really important to have effective interactions. And so these are also other things I've been excited about in terms of extending this idea of a co-pilot in real-time interactions. The other things I've been thinking about go into the multimodal space. So I think the multimodal space has been, I think like an increasingly really popular space for AI. And so what I mean by this is like both in the sense of like being able to understand streams of images or like speech, but also I think one thing that I've been really interested in is like the generation part of when experts are in interactions, they don't just generate text, but they also might guide the student visually on the whiteboard, or they might give some verbal cues to be able to hint or nudge the student. And I think there's a lot of really fascinating questions, both in the side of like the computer science side, as well as the education side of like what goes in that kind of expertise for you to have a really effective interaction that spans so many different modalities and so many things for you to think about before you actually take an action in that interaction. And then finally, the last part is I think broadly, I've been really excited about this, this kind of maybe reemergent excitement for the human AI collaboration paradigm. So how do we actually learn using these human AI tools or collaborative tools? So concretely, for instance, you might be interested about like how are novices actually using tutor co-pilot suggestions? You might also be interested in like, what happens when you remove the training wheels of an AI co-pilot, or even just broadly the question of like, what are the effective kinds of interfaces for you to enable that kind of seamless integration into what, real people are doing rather than like forcing them to go switch their tabs onto ChatGPT. And so at least for the first question for like how novices use AI tools, what I've put up here on the board, is on the top, I'm showing you in purple the original, one of the original tutor co-pilot suggestions that was generated. So I'm just going to read it out loud in case people can't see. It says, remember when we're moving up, like going from the lobby to the 10th floor, we're dealing with positive integers. So you can't see the conversation context that's generating for, but essentially in this kind of problem, the tutor was trying to, this problem that the student was working on was trying to understand how to map going up to positive numbers and going down to negative numbers. But what you can see here in the novice's response is that they didn't directly take the suggestion from the model. What they instead wrote was, we need to figure out how this can be written as a number. There are two types of integers, positive and negative. So the distinction I kind of want to draw on here is that in the purple box, we're seeing that the copilot directly just maps like, hey, think of going up as positive integers, whereas the tutor is taking a slightly different route where they're kind of scaffolding the idea of like, there exist two integers in the world. And the reason why I'm showing you this example is because I think that there's this really emergent and exciting space of like, how do we take inspiration and how do we effectively use and learn these kinds of thinking tools? Because clearly, at least qualitatively in the data, what I'm seeing is that novices are not just like, seeing the suggestions and copying and pasting to things. They are actively thinking about like, how can they scaffold this problem a little bit more so that students can better understand the concept they have to learn. And so I think this is just a really exciting piece of evidence to at least get us thinking about like what this future potential of training novices and the kind of effect it might have on students could look like. And so with that, I'll just end on this slide. Yeah, thank you.